So we will wait 1 more minute, 2 at most. Let's see who's here. Josh, Michael, welcome. One more minute and we will get started. Are you guys doing well tonight?
Yep. Yes.
Good. All right, as soon as I plug in my power supply to my laptop, we will get started. Okay, we're going to start by looking at this paragraph, which is from the readings from this week. And Josh, what do you think about this paragraph? Michael, you want to help him out?
One sec, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Oh, sorry. I'm just on my phone, so I'm having trouble reading it. But it looks like, as far as I can tell, it looks like it's describing sort of violence against women online.
Yeah.
Correct? And I think that sort of ties back to like some of the stuff we were talking about earlier, is kind of like how there's sort of like disintegration between like what happens online and what happens in like real life, that it becomes difficult, how one thing seeps over into another.
True. True. Other comments so far?
Hi, this is Josh. I don't know if you were talking to me. I had stepped away to get some water, but the comment I had on this is it seems like it might be slightly different than just the straightforward, I wouldn't do this in real life, but I'll do it on the internet mentality. In that I won't say a lot, but some of these guys might actually want to do this in real life, but just don't for fear of repercussions. So like the desire to act it out in real life might be real, but they just don't for whatever reason.
Well, I think the for whatever reason is one of the most telling and important parts of the conversation. For example, we continue to operate under the assumption that Therefore, there are no real world consequences. Secondly, we operate under the assumption that because it's virtual, no rules apply. Because ultimately there's no real victim. And third, we're missing the fact that the virtual world mirrors the physical world. In fact, interestingly, thinking about our conversation last week, what happened this week, or what happened between our lecture last Monday and this Monday that actually picks up a theme we touched on last time? Anybody know? It involved, go ahead.
Oh, didn't Facebook change its name
Yes.
to
To,
Meta?
yes, from,
Facebook?
no,
Oh, from metaverse. Oh, excuse me. Like you mean from the word? Yeah.
yeah. Mm-hmm. And why is that important to the conversation we're having tonight and to the one we had last week?
I believe they changed it because of the certain sort of like negative association that Facebook has gotten over cyberbullying and things like that.
Yes, but it's also a direct reference to a novel called Neuromancer. Anyone remember that conversation last week? Okay. Neuromancer was written in the 1990s. And the main character, using a visor, switches between the physical world and the metaverse. What we now call AR or VR. And at that point, both the physical universe and the metaverse exist in a kind of side by side, such that if you think about the implication, they're parallel universes. The only difference is that one is physical and one is not. So the claim that they're equally real has profound implications for our society. So what do you think about that?
It's often presented as sort of an escape hatch to, like, what was that movie called? Ready Player One, addressed a similar concept. People lived such horrid lives in the physical world that it was almost a joy or an escape to go into the virtual one. So who says, like, in a case like that, if it's substantially real and there's human interaction via, even if it's via computer communication or avatars or what have you, is that any less real than physical life?
Well, that becomes the fundamental question. If you remember the article a week or two ago about virtual communities and Second Life, people craft lives on that site that are arguably or not arguably as real as their everyday life for exactly the same reason you just mentioned. I hate my life in the physical world. I can go to this other world in which everything is the way that I want the world to be. And our assumption has been that because it is virtual, that's the argument over and over. But part of the problem is we no longer know what this word means. And that's in part the point of this passage in the article. Was she physically raped? No. But was she raped? Yes. Do you see my point?
Yes.
No.
I think so, yeah.
Try it this way. Whether part of the physical world or not. She was traumatized. She was harmed. Everyone agreed?
Yep.
Definitely, yeah.
Okay. So go deeper. What's going on here?
I guess like I would say that there's kind of like a breakdown between or like between kind of like the simulation of and like what's being simulated, like sort of the online world is kind of just like it's supposed to be just sort of a simulated reality, but it's bleeding over into reality until the point that there isn't really a hard and fast distinction between the two.
Well, that
And
part
the
is for
effects,
sure.
and the effects are the same.
Uh-huh. Anyone else want to make a comment? Okay. Would any of those men in the so-called, all right, let's agree on terms. We're not going to distinguish between the real world and virtual. We're going to distinguish between the physical world and the virtual world. We're going to do that because they're both real. Whatever distinction there was between those two worlds has been lost. We all agreed?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
So here's the difference. No one has ever been arrested for rape in the metaverse. There are no laws and there are no taboos. So I hate to bring up, as they say, to beat a dead horse, but once again, we come back to one of the core points in our class, which is to say that intellectually, experientially, emotionally, we are still in the 17th century. Experientially,
Can I make a comment?
of course.
Yeah, like, what this kind of reminds me of is discussion we had, like, not in this class, but a class I had with you a long time ago, but about online dating, right? Like, I know that it's common for people to send like unsolicited nudes or send really mean things or ghost people or things like that. And one of the thoughts that comes to mind here is like, if someone did that in the physical world, right, that would be criminal, right? If someone just went up and flashed somebody or something like that. But on the virtual world, it's just so commonplace that people are desensitized to it.
Well, and part of the problem is that because our concept of taboo and our concept of law is tied to the 17th century, there's no bridge between the 17th century and 21st century reality. You know, what I hear is things like, well, there is harm and there is a foul and it is real. Cyberbullying, cyber rape are increasingly serious problems. But again, there is no mechanism because our laws have no applicability to 21st century reality. Do you see the point?
Yep.
I would have to check, but I don't know that any law has been passed making cyberbullying a crime. or cyber rape?
There are laws that when you send nudes to just random people, that is a crime. I think Finland is one of the first countries to implement that.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Let me rephrase that. I don't know of any such law in the United States. I'm glad to see that European countries are at least dealing with it. All right, any other comments so far? All right. Let's go at this a different way. Who was Maslow?
He's responsible for the hierarchy of needs, from the physiological to the self-actualization at the top.
Yep. Let's take an abbreviated look at this. In fact, let's look at it from a different perspective, but let's keep in mind that ultimately the foundational work was done by Maslow. I think that ultimately we can prioritize the top 3 human needs as follows. So when we look at emotional intimacy, the degree to which we open ourselves varies with the situation or the context. I don't share typically with my family the depths of the secrets that I share with my best friend. I don't share what I share with my best friend with a casual friend as in a coworker. But whether it's sexual or emotional, there is a deep need to connect. I would argue that in the end, even sexual intimacy involves a deep emotional connection, or it can be a harrowing experience. More about that in a minute. So, is this clear so far? Josh, what do you think?
Yes, yeah, it's the way you've laid it out is clear.
Okay, Johannes, you okay with it?
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay. So, if you think about the nature of intimacy, the need to connect and the need to feel connected becomes the essence of community. In fact, you can define community as I may not see my best friend for 5 years, but if that person is truly my best friend, when I see that person again, we are connected at the depth we were when we saw each other for coffee every day. So community relies heavily on concepts, intimacy, and safety. I feel safe when I have a balance between self and other humans. I don't feel safe in situations where my personhood is ignored. In fact, two of the words that keep coming up are alienation. I'm cut off from any sense of community. Depersonalization. I have lost my sense of self. So if you think about this in terms of the social moral problems that we're facing, when alienation and depersonalization are rampant, I don't feel safe. If I don't feel safe, I don't have any intimacy. If I don't have any intimacy, I'm going to end up depersonalized. If I don't have any community, I end up alienated. And here we are. And within the context of a lack of intimacy, so why has sex trafficking become a problem? Why has human trafficking become a problem? Why are an increasing number of teenagers buying webcams and masturbating online? Why is pornography the problem it is? The answer is ultimately because we are depersonalized, we are alienated, and we live in a totally objectified world. That's okay. Welcome, John. No worries. Does this make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so if I can't perceive you as human, if I can't connect to you as human, then you become an object. If you're an object, then I would do things to you I would absolutely never do to you if I perceived you to be a human being. When you keep in mind that we live in a life negative culture, it makes it all the worse. Because the tendency in a life negative culture is to dehumanize, to treat people as objects, not as human. Questions so far? Thoughts so far?
My question would be, like, I totally understand what we're saying here, but how would we sort of define the terms of like a human or being treated as an object, and specifically, like, let's say, where would animals fall within that as well?
Well, the same objects as humans.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's an accident that in the last 40 years, animal rights has become an issue.
Yeah.
Again, one of the points that we made or have been making is the lack of a sense of human uniqueness, for better or worse. See if I have it open. Yeah, if you haven't seen it, you might want to look at this book. He was on 60 Minutes last night. And in addition to his conversation about what's unique about how humans evolve, is his argument that the next life form, which we will create and which will ultimately be our undoing, will be silicon based. So the problem becomes complex on multiple fronts. For example, one of the points that we've made since the beginning in this class is that between 1624 and 1873, with the rise of deism, remember Edward Herbert and his argument that you can't begin with a definition of human you have to derive it from observation. And remember, the point that we made was that however he's right, and there is something fundamentally right about that, what he didn't see was that there would be no universal or concrete answer. Because of that, the question becomes, how do we make moral decisions And instead of answering the human question, it made it even worse. So the point that we've been making since the beginning of the semester was the consequence of this becomes utilitarianism. By its definition, when you consider the greatest good, you're objectifying humans. Because you're assigning each human an arbitrary value. The second problem is that if there is no universal definition, of what it means to be human, how do I know who I am? And the point that I've been making to you all semester is you don't, and you can't. And this has given rise to the cult of the individual. And in modern parlance, we call it diversity. So when we think about what that implies, let's think of it in terms of a funnel turned upside down. The last thing I think about is my humanity. What I do think about how I'm unique and how I'm different. Okay, you're a community of one. Bravo. Are you going to be able to meet your need for intimacy? No. Are you going to have community? No. Are you ever going to feel safe? Oh, no. No. When I look at you, am I going to see another human being? No. I'm going to see someone other than me. And by definition, when you are other than me, game, set, match. When you're other than me, you're an object. So the modern world, the world in which we live,
is all about like objectification and alienation.
yep. And we wonder why we're suffering massive addiction and depersonalization, depression, suicide. Why would we not? Before I go further, is this making sense?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, it makes sense. But I was just gonna sort of push in on it a little bit, just to like so I guess the question is, what does it mean to be human then? Like, what is the, so if humans, obviously we're not objects, right? But we're treated as objects, right? Then what is interacting with someone humanely, or what is it to treat someone else as human, right? Because right now, what I think we're talking about is like treating a human being is like treating them on the same category as myself.
So
Yeah,
like,
well, you're right. And before we look at that, we've had the biochemical discussion before,
Mhm.
but let's look at it again briefly. In a world dominated by alienation, depersonalization, and a lack of safety, cortisol and dopamine are going to be rampant. Cortisol, fight or flight, shuts down your immune system. It shuts down your digestive system. So why are we surprised that obesity is epidemic? Diabetes, heart disease. Why are we surprised? Our bodies can't function in this world. We're making ourselves sick. And the more depressed we become, the more suicidal we become, the greater the cortisol and dopamine levels in our body.
well, don't, to an extent, like, doesn't that have to do with also just like our diet?
It's very complicated, yes. But for example, if I need to feel good about myself, dopamine is triggered in a lot of different ways, even in a sense of community. But in a world in which everything is upside down, I want to eat so that I feel good. And I'm going to eat those things that give me a dopamine high. And since dopamine has a very short lifespan in the blood, and since the more dopamine I get, the more dopamine I have to get, in other words, like heroin, the more dopamine you have, the more you have to get the same effect. It takes over your life. So we basically eat ourselves into oblivion, because it comes back to a comment I made last week. Humans have needs. We either take care of those needs or they take care of themselves. And when they take care of themselves, we get hurt. And here we are. So, if we go back to Edward Herbert, what Herbert said was right. We need to go back and take a look from a point of observation, not start out with a definition. But diversity is not the answer. We cannot live without community, and we cannot live without intimacy. And if I start out with the assumption that I'm alone in the universe, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Which is why from the beginning of the class, I've been arguing that we need to talk about not diversity, but inclusivity. So by way of contrast, this is the only way it's going to work. When I start out by focusing on all those things that we have in common, then I am prioritizing the need for community and intimacy. I'm going to feel safe. And biochemically, that means serotonin and oxytocin. The latter is tied to our sense of belonging. If we have nothing in common, then there's no reason to have a conversation. And we're at the point where we choose our own gender, we choose our own sexuality, we know, we think what's right for us. Our response to every moral problem is to say, well, if he or she can justify it, who am I to tell them? Well, then why are we surprised that a woman masquerading as a 15-year-old is subject to cyber rape? We shouldn't be. We should be surprised that rape is not more prominent in the physical world. Am I making sense?
Yes.
Okay. So, Miles, if you're still here, what are you thinking? Miles Mitchell,
Yes, sir.
what are you thinking?
I'm kind of, I guess, I understand a little bit, but not really.
Okay. What can I clarify for you?
I guess kind of like, I know like a big one was in this class is like what it means to be human. And that's like, so I guess kind of correlating human and like what we have in common.
Okay. Well, try it this way. In my ethics and entrepreneurship class today, we watched a video by Simon Sinek called Leaders Eat Last. And one of the points that Sinek makes across multiple videos and in many of his books is that the complexity of being human is that we are aware of ourselves both as a self, therefore as an individual, but we're also aware of ourselves as a member of a community. And the point that I was just making, which is similar to the point that he's making, is that ultimately all human needs require both a sense of community and a sense of self.
What do you mean by sense of community?
I need to feel that I belong. I need to know that someone's got my back. I need to know that someone cares.
As in a social aspect?
Yeah, absolutely. For example, if you think about it, I'm an adjunct. I am part-time. I have no benefits. I'm expendable. I could be gone next semester, or I can be back and I never know. Ask yourself, do you think I feel safe? Do you think I feel like I'm part of a community? No, absolutely not.
So kind of bouncing off that, like, okay, I mean, I don't really know about anybody else in this call, but I'm a sophomore, so this is my second year here now. And like, you know, when you go to a new school, especially like this college, you have to meet like new friends and new people. And then sometimes you room with these new people and you're essentially speaking, you know, minimal amounts of conversations between these people and then acting like you are like now able to live with each other while like fully trusting each other. So I think that like has to do with what you're saying, because you have this sense of trust or distrust in the world, and it's like deeply embedded even into our society in the aspect that you're going to school with these people and there's mass school shootings. Like, you're supposed to trust the people you go to school with, but you don't actually know whether you can actually trust the people you're surrounding yourself with on a day-to-day basis. Like, even your friends that I've made like in college that I would consider very close friends now, these are still people that I've only known for like maybe a year. And in some scenarios I would like trust them very deeply, but you know, I've only known them for so long. Like, what do I really know about them?
Well, you're right. And one of the points I want to come back to, which we made at the beginning of the class, we live in a life negative culture. And the values in a life negative culture are sadism, masochism, and necrophilia. If you think about how these apply in real terms, we've just made it worse. That's all.
Now, what do you say to people who argue that things like this are, now, I don't believe this obviously, but I've noticed sort of a trend where people argue that these type of things are actually kind of like liberatory or empowering, right? The idea of like, I don't know, objectifying yourself or something like that. You know, I know that there's people nowadays who are starting like fight clubs because they totally missed the point of the movie. You know, people who argue that sort of like pornography is kind of like a self-empowering thing or something like that.
Well, we've done the same thing with sex, haven't we?
Mm-hmm.
We have reduced sex with Tinder to a commodity. I don't really want to know who you are. I really don't want the emotional intimacy. I just want to have sex with you.
Yes, I understand that. But I think like I know some people who I've talked to about this issue, sort of like about online dating and this type of stuff. Like they argue that like that's actually a good thing. Like that's actually
what they want, and that's empowering, that you don't have to have
Yeah.
all that emotional baggage.
Okay.
Now, what would
well,
you say to someone like that?
I'll say this. What better way to objectify, depersonalize, and dehumanize you than to convince you that objectifying, depersonalizing, and dehumanizing yourself is the ultimate act of self-expression and freedom? No, it's not. And this is exactly what we're doing. Until we begin to think about and go back to the fundamental question of what it means to be human. Until we recognize that Herbert was right but wrong. Until we get rid of utilitarianism and situational ethics, we're not going to fix these problems. They're going to continue to get worse. And whatever we ultimately do with Facebook, Snapchat, WhatsApp, Instagram, we're only treating the symptom. We're not treating the cause. The solution is not
I have a
continuing to do. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
When you say the solution is to change from utilitarianism and situational ethics to a different kind of ethics, how would that look in practice?
Well, that's a great question. And let me remind you that I'm alive because people who had no reason to care about me did, starting from the time that I was 7 years old. And we've talked about this in part. We're probably going to go over a few minutes. John, if you need to leave, I understand. If you remember a conversation we had earlier in the semester about Martin Heidegger, Heidegger said that we encounter two objects in the world. There are objects that are present to hand, and there are objects that are there alongside. Anything that is not human is present to hand. If I recognize you as there alongside, I am recognizing that you are thrown towards death like I am. And the point that we made earlier in the semester, which Heidegger makes, is that I have two choices in the face of death. Sorg, or despair and denial. If you recall, we said that there are many words that translate Sorg into English, none of which capture the heart of what the word means. But we said that when we think about the Frenchman Albert Camus, he referred to this as the logic of the absurd. And the logic of the absurd is loving in a world in which all that is human dies. If I love you, am I going to objectify you? No. Am I going to use you as a means to get a better job? No. Am I going to look down on you because you're a person of color? No. Care, compassion, love, kindness, nurturing. If you truly embrace the world from the position of Zorg, you will never depersonalize yourself or another human. You will never treat a person as an object, as a means to an end. Never.
So I get that, but that seems like a individual approach. Like this is something every individual has to decide on their own.
Yes. And the second piece, I think, is this. We need to get rid of Darwin's idea that the end of human evolution is the nation. Because what Darwin failed to see was that as human society becomes more complex, alienation increases, community decreases. Our sense of being alone, our feelings of being unsafe. What Darwin missed is that the real balance was found in the extended family. In other words, a tribe. The breakdown that we're seeing in Western culture and the return to tribal life is not accidental. It is where we belong. The problem is that the tribes we're forming are inherently toxic. We need to return to the intimacy, safety, and community of the tribe. If we don't tackle both halves of the problem, we don't have a future. Other questions or thoughts so far?
So it basically means that we cannot achieve this with nations in place.
No. There were studies done in the late 60s, early 70s in New York City. The studies focused on the following: the number of floors in a building, the amount of graffiti and the amount of crime. They found that on the
Good
6th,
question. Graffiti
Yep.
in the building or just close to the building?
in the building, in and around the building, they found that when the building got larger than 6 stories, both of these began to become a problem because of a growing sense of alienation. When it got to 13th floor, all hell broke loose. So one of the points that I would make is that depersonalization and alienation are built into the complexity of urban society. Like rats in a maze. We need the intimacy of community. And when we don't have it, alienation, depersonalization, objectification, crime, addiction, violence, all rise. We wouldn't need social media if the extended family was still viable. Am I making sense?
It makes sense. It's just sad to think about.
Okay. Joshua, what are your thoughts?
I'm just wondering how economics factors into that, because like the higher density implies lower rents, or geared towards less well-off people, and people in poverty tend to have a higher crime rate. So I'm just wondering like how the finances factor into this as well.
I've done a lot of work on social Darwinism, beginning with Edward Spencer. And part of the problem is that because of the nature of social Darwinism in our culture, and that plays a big role in it. As I told you, I believe I got into a very heated conversation with a very conservative friend of mine before the last election. And he is pro-life. And my comment to him was, let's be real. If you could prevent all white women who were middle class and higher from having an abortion, you wouldn't give a rat's ass how many women of color did, or how many poor white women did, would you? He never answered. And that's part of the reality of why we are where we are. Go back to the lecture last week. The nuclear family began breaking down in 1800. We're 221 years later, and we still haven't fixed the problem. Who is most impacted by the breakdown of the nuclear family? Who's more likely to get raped? Who's more likely to die a violent death? Who lives a shorter lifespan? Who has worse health? We do. Because we have less value. And the point I've made over and over and over again is we picked this right up out of ancient Greece. Nothing has changed. The problems have gotten worse. So
Can
part
I-
of the answer to your, sorry, go ahead, question?
Oh, well, I mean, if you're answering the question, I was just gonna make a comment.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I was just reading a book recently, and I think to answer the question, like, how does this look on a large scale? A passage from Cornell West, I think that said, like, justice is love on a large scale.
Mhm.
Right? So in a sense, it's kind of like if these people were given justice, like fair housing and a sense of community and all these other things, that's basically what individual love on a mass scale would look like.
Well, the reality of the matter is that as much as I appreciate what Cornell West generally says, he misses the point.
Oh.
Until we erase the distinction between rich and poor.
Okay.
And by that, I don't mean making everybody have the same socioeconomic income. When we begin to realize that rich or poor, you're still fully human, and that being rich doesn't entitle you to being more human, the problems won't be fixed.
And the second part of that is sort of a question, which is you sort of stated that you can't achieve this with states in place, correct? Like nation states in place.
But not in the current configuration, you can't.
So what would the solution entail? Like, would it be sort of like an anarchist type solution, or what would it be like with no nation states?
No, number one, we need to get past the problem we have with states' rights. Number two, we have to recognize that the extended family, not the city, not the neighborhood, is the basic social unit. Number two, we have to figure out how we're going to rebuild the nuclear family. Only then is an extended family possible. And once we get to that point and we have a society that actually takes responsibility for its children, we can address some of the larger questions.
What about some societies like Western societies like in Asia or Hispanic societies where your extended family is the people you care for? Would you still see issues in those types of societies?
Only insofar as ultimately they can be sectarian and ultimately they're going to get broken down. I grew up in a very large extended family, which eventually got pulled apart. The more that we, quote, assimilated, unquote, the more the nuclear family broke down. And then I left New Haven when I graduated Yale and proceeded to move to Atlanta, Georgia. Add to that the fact that I'm extremely different than my family and I've got no family. You want to talk about alienated? I can give you chapter and verse. So we have to go back to the root. We have to figure out how to have a viable family structure in the 21st century. We need to figure out how to build some semblance of an extended family in the 21st century. We need to figure out how to stop the inherent pattern of objectification, particularly of women in our culture. We need to figure out how to raise children with a sense of identity that is neither radically individual nor radically oppressive. Passing laws won't fix that. We have to figure out how we're going to do it. I wish
So
I
this
had.
is completely beyond any type of government to be able to solve. It's between humans themselves.
Not when you have politicians who are inherently corrupt. Think about it. Manchin, after all of his dickering, has now decided he hasn't got enough. He's worth $450 million in coal. How can we expect him to be honest or think about the greatest good? Or Sinema, who took $750,000 from pharma in campaign donations. How can we expect them to make a decision based upon what's really good? Good for all of us. We can't. If you came to me, as I've said, and said, Falcon, how much would it cost me to get a B? That would be a bribe. And if you came to me and said, Falcon, you're tired, how about a weekend in Hilton Head? And by the way, if you really like it, how about an A? That's called a campaign donation. Still a bribe. And yet we ignore it because the people who are in power are corrupt. So as long as we put up with it, once again, we have a political system that was designed for the 17th century. It is now the 21st, and there's nothing we can do about it. So the polarization will get worse, the alienation will get worse, the objectification will get worse, and the ultimate end will be a civil war. We can't even come up with workable laws in this country that make cyber rape punishable. We can't even get our population to be vaccinated. A scathing indictment. Any last questions before we come to an end? Okay, I apologize for being passionate, but I think you know me well enough by now to know that's sort of the way it goes. Let me stop the recording. I will take attendance and then I will let you go.